Hey, so last time you saw me, a mystery man transformed me into a 16-bit sprite and sent me into a dark world where monsters tried to f*** me. Nowadays though, I've upgraded to being only a slightly pixelated version of my former self, and I don't even need that text box to speak anymore. Reminds me of when I died after finding out trains existed. Anyways, I found my way out of this dark world through this big door that just says exit the dark world on it, so I'm gonna walk through there. But first, I wanted to talk about this game I've been playing while traversing the dark world. It's a little indie title called Falls-Deltarune. Yeah, that one. So sit down here with me next to this blue fire, and let's talk about it. Alright, there's a FNAF reference in Hometown, and now I've met my quota. Well, it's finally time to talk about something other than FNAF, so how about that other hyperfixation Twitter has? Deltarune, for those of you who have been living under a rock and absorbing plankton for nutrients, is the current game in production by Toby Fox. It exists in a parallel universe to Fox's previous smash hit Undertale, and in many ways it plays similarly. However, Deltarune seems to be shaping up to not just be a longer game than Undertale, but a much more realized story as well. Undertale is well known for its branching stories based on how you play, and Deltarune is pretty much the same thing in that regard. However, not only is there more depth in how you interact with the world, but with the addition of a party, your dialogue among your team becomes an integral piece of the story that Undertale simply lacks since you play by yourself the whole time. Now, I should mention that since the game isn't complete yet, we don't know of the benefits or detriments of a pacifist or genocide route. But with Chapter 2, we were introduced to the Snowgrave route, where you essentially corrupt a teenager into making her a murderer, and you're rewarded with the best song in the game during a boss fight, which, after I researched it, you can have this fight regardless of this route, so it's literally just the be a piece of shit route. But in this video, as much as I would love it to be a full review of Chapters 1 and 2, it has a different purpose. Similar to FNAF, Deltarune as a game has dozens of theories surrounding it. For this video, I decided to talk about the one theory that I really kinda hope isn't true, but I would not be surprised if it is. The theory is that Ralsei, the prince from the dark, is going to betray the main playable character, Chris. But first, who is Ralsei? Ralsei is first introduced in Chapter 1, as the prince telling the story of the Deltarune, and who ultimately recruits Chris and Susie as the Lighteners who will save the Dark World from destruction. Ralsei joins the party in this chapter and functions as the healer. He also instructs Chris to use mercy on their foes instead of killing them, something Susie decidedly ignores at first. By the end of Chapter 1, Ralsei drops his hat and shows his face in the light, revealing himself to be a goat monster similar to Toriel, Asgore, and Asriel. This has actually led to theories in itself, but for the moment we're sticking with the betrayal theory. In Chapter 2, Ralsei joins Chris and Susie in the cyberworld, helping them take down Birdly and Queen. His importance in this chapter is much less pronounced, however, that's not to say he doesn't behave strangely still. First thing that should probably tip you off is how he somehow manages to get to the cyberworld following Chris and Susie, despite not being able to leave the Dark World. Or further, how Ralsei himself explains Darkners can only exist within their own Dark Worlds or they turn to stone, but he never does. It implies that there's something else going on with him. At the very least, he's not your average Darkner. If he is a Darkner, anyway. The only notable development he has aside from that is in the Tunnel of Love with Chris, where you can choose to hug him because why not? I'm sure he doesn't have a knife in his hand or anything. At the end of the chapter, he once again says goodbye to Chris and Susie and hopes they come help him again soon. So why would this goat boy be so evil and dastardly? Well, it's just that he's way too nice. Like literally, that's a part of it. As the Prince of Darkness, which is already the nickname for Lucifer, literally, you have to consider what his role is in the story. Fountains of darkness are corrupting the world of dark and light, essentially making a flood that will swallow both in darkness. So it stands to reason that, as a representative of that dark, Ralsei might have a stake in making sure those fountains stay opened up. It's also worth noting that Ralsei is the one to try and dissuade Chris from using violence to solve their problems, perhaps hinting that Ralsei wants Chris to remain weak. In both Undertale and Deltarune, you only gain experience from killing an opponent, which makes you stronger overall. If it were me, I'd also try and convince my mortal enemy to stay nice and soft and squishy. And yet there's one problem with this already. Ralsei is a healer, and makes sure Chris and Susie stay patched up in battle. Why would Ralsei do this if he actually wanted them dead? Well, it's entirely possible that Ralsei knows Chris and Susie would fight him back if they had any idea he was plotting against them. He's playing the long con. Ralsei also seems to try to get very close to Chris, even driving a wedge between them and Susie as Chapter 1 draws on. Ralsei also seems to want to stay close to Chris specifically, often complimenting them or otherwise being unnecessarily positive for no other reason than to be soft and cute. The Tunnel of Love scene specifically comes to me as being a bit odd, as Ralsei seems surprised when Chris hugs him, as if he didn't expect Chris to feel that way about him. It comes off as a bit suspicious to me anyway. But the biggest piece of evidence to me comes in not how Ralsei acts, but in who he represents. I'm gonna delve into a bit of spoiler territory here, so if you haven't beaten Undertale before, I'd recommend you do that before watching the rest of this video. Alright, so Ralsei is in some way connected to Asriel. That should come as no surprise if you paid close attention to your environment when playing. We know that Asriel in Deltarune is older than Asriel in Undertale, a college-age adult from what we know, actually probably making him a similar age to his boss form in Undertale. We also know that Chris had a very strong connection with Asriel. Let's face it, adopted or not, Chris and Asriel are siblings. How does Ralsei play into this? Well, look at this. Across both Undertale and Deltarune, goat horn colors have been inconsistent. Toriel's horns are short and white, and Asgore's are long and yellow, just like his. But Asriel, as an adult, well, I mean, we don't know since the sprite only appears in black and white, and as a child, he had no horns. Ralsei, meanwhile, has red horns, and we know that this universe's Asriel also has horns because Chris made a set of fake ones to emulate him. Fake red horns. This has actually been used as evidence that Ralsei, similar to the playing cards in the closet, is simply an item in the light world, in this case the fake horns. However, since I don't believe that's the case with him, this would mean that Asriel most likely had red horns, since Chris made the horns to be more like him. Next up, let's look at the name Ralsei. This might be obvious to you, might not be, but it's an anagram of the word Asriel. There's definitely a connection now. But if the two are indeed connected through horn color and name, why do I think Ralsei is secretly evil? Well, let's look at Undertale's story. In Undertale's story, the child known as Kara falls into the underground, where they are rescued by Asriel and his family. However, Kara falls ill, and Asriel is forced to bring them out of the underground and back to humanity to have any shot at saving their life. However, after laying Kara in a bed of flowers, Asriel is swarmed and killed by a mob of humans who thought he was killing the human child. This led to Asriel's spirit infecting the flower bed he died on and becoming the initial and main antagonist of the game, Flowey. Upon eventually defeating Asriel with mercy, Frisk is able to talk to the ghost of the goat child who was killed in a tragic misunderstanding. Asriel is put to rest, and the game is able to end, in the most peaceful and canon ending to Undertale. So what does that mean for Ralsei in Deltarune? Well, to put it simply, I think Ralsei is essentially Deltarune's Flowey. He's kind, bubbly, eager to help on the outside, but he's harboring something cruel and deadly within. In fact, the game itself may want us to think that as literally as possible. Both Flowey and Ralsei give you the combat tutorials in their games, and have almost the same dialogue in either instance, despite Deltarune encouraging the players to play Undertale before they play this game. I also think that whatever Ralsei really is, there's a reason he appears as he does. He looks like Asriel to Chris. Everything down to his name, his actions, his horns, they're all made to lure Chris into liking and trusting Ralsei as a member of the team, by using the image of Chris's brother. It actually wouldn't be the first time in Deltarune we've met stand-ins for existing characters in the Dark World. Spamton, for example, seems to be the alternate universe version of Mettaton, right down to having ton at the end of both of their names. After pouring through the information we have from the first two chapters of the game, with many more on the way, I have a feeling that if Ralsei is a villain, we're probably going to find out sooner rather than later. In my opinion, we have enough evidence now to definitely make an assumption, but we really need something more solid within the next couple chapters to make that full leap. The last thing I want to add is that something screwed up is happening to Chris at the end of each chapter, being possessed and taken out of the player's control. At the end of chapter 2, we straight up see Chris make a dark fountain, indicating that someone else is controlling them. Or, you know, there's the theory that Chris is actually a villain and is only a good guy when in the player's control, but I think it's probably actually Ralsei. This would explain why Ralsei is okay with shutting down the Dark Fountains in the Card Kingdom and the Cyberworld. He'll just make others using Chris's body. Maybe the reason Ralsei likes to stay so close to Chris is to get a sort of control over them. If that is the case, this makes Ralsei one of the most horrific villains across Undertale and Deltarune. Say what you will about Asriel wanting to destroy the world or whatever, at least he was honest with that most of the time. Ralsei has been on screen much longer and is even considered a playable character. The con is thick. One last thing I want to mention that I only thought of when replaying Deltarune to capture footage for this video, I noticed something peculiar about the prophecy Ralsei tells Chris and Susie. First off, we've established that there is more to Ralsei than meets the eye, so I think we can call him an unreliable narrator. When he says that the two Lightners would be joined by a Prince of the Dark, he could totally be lying. In fact, much of this prophecy could just be a lie, but it's in the visuals of the prophecy that I think are most interesting. During the storyboard sequence, we see a human who is clearly Chris, a monster who is clearly Susie, and a shadowy, hooded figure that Ralsei would have you believe is him. However, we never see what they look like underneath this hood, and they otherwise don't really bear much of Ralsei's silhouette. But let's assume the prophecy is true, but Ralsei is still a traitor. Surely these two statements can't coexist. Except, they can. There are other princes of the dark. We know this much because we met one already. Lancer. And who else plays an oddly important role in the prophecy, representing the people in the Dark World? Lancer. Note the seed-shaped head they both have and round body. Who initially wants to destroy the Lightners but forms an actual, tangible friendship with them through their actions in saving him from his father? It's him. My own theory is that eventually Ralsei will be revealed to be the villain of the game, and in his place, Lancer will be the Prince of the Dark who helps Chris and Susie fulfill the prophecy, with their biggest foe being the friend-turned-traitor. As for the prophecy, the game makes a point of having this set of symbols hanging in the air above the end of the world. These symbols make up the Deltarune. In fact, it was even called the Deltarune in Undertale. But what these symbols actually represented in that game was the form the final boss took, the god of hyperdeath. And who was that god? Asriel. So perhaps Ralsei is there at the end, just in his newer, truer form. But after all that, I'm sure many of you are wondering, well, what about Gaster? And the other half of you are wondering, who the hell is Gaster? So let me explain. W.D. Gaster was a character first introduced in Undertale as a sort of fake scrapped character who was able to be found by manipulating the game files. Well, not so much found, but hinted at. He spoke exclusively in Wingding font, and because of this, and his last name sounding like Aster font, he's often believed to be a skeleton character similar to Papyrus and Sans. Gaster was the royal scientist and creator of the core in Undertale before supposedly falling into his own machine and dying, having his body and soul distributed throughout time and space. In Deltarune, his presence can definitely be felt, as there's evidence that he had direct influence on both Jevil and Spamton, and may in fact be the one who brought Chris into the whole story. The fact is, by all accounts, Gaster is a more likely final boss of sorts than Ralsei in some people's eyes. And while I agree Gaster is important to the story, that doesn't really undo all the speculation I just made. There's no reason the two can't coexist. Deltarune seems to be building up to a battle against an angel, which to me is unusual. In Undertale, the final battle was against a god. Also, you remember how I said Ralsei being a Prince of the Dark was comparable to Lucifer's title? Well, Lucifer is also known for being an angel who fell to Earth. Perhaps then that's another hint at what Ralsei will eventually be revealed as. So is it possible that Ralsei is the angel and Gaster is a god pulling the strings? Maybe. More likely, in my opinion, is that Gaster will probably be a kind of penultimate boss. He reveals to Chris and the player what he's done, how everything has been to his influence. But if you played Deltarune, you'd know this guy has his limits. Rather than just driving Spamton insane with his mind or whatever, he had to talk to him over the phone for a long time, under the name Mike, and Spamton only went mad when Gaster left. To drive Jevil mad, he also had to talk to him, and reveal some knowledge that made Jevil insane, but also enlightened. Essentially, Gaster is not exactly on the power level so many people think he is, but I won't deny that he has potential as a boss. I just still think Ralsei would be better for the narrative, and for the evidence we have right now. As of this recording, we do not know if what I've just said is true, but I feel like it has to be. There is definitely a connection between Ralsei and Asriel, and I don't think it's as simple as Ralsei being a manifestation of Chris's good thoughts of their brother. Considering Ralsei's larger role in the narrative, I just feel like he's hiding something, well, dark. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it deviates from my usual content, but hey, it gave me an excuse to replay Deltarune. I don't mind at all. In the end, I was really just happy to have a solid video idea that wasn't FNAF related. Don't get me wrong, I love that series, but it's good to change it up from time to time. Just don't ask me to play Friday Night Funkin'. Well, that's all out of me for today. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video around. I have a door to walk through. Peace.